Hello, History 362. All right, so it's Alexander the Great week, an exciting week. And I actually want to talk about first, not Alexander the Great, but rather the Achaemenid Empire. Again, the period prior to the 330s BC, even though we oftentimes refer to it as classical Greek history, really is, for all intents and purposes, Achaemenid history. The Achaemenids are the dominant empire and have been since the middle of the 6th century, when the empire's founder, a real person, but most of what we know about him is legendary, Cyrus the Great, goes on a conquest spree and from his base in the Zagros Mountains in the Kingdom of Persia, eventually conquers a huge amount of territory, including Anatolia, where Cyrus overthrows the Lydian Empire, and also he overthrows the Neo-Babylonian Empire by capturing Babylon in 539 BC. And one of the long-term cultural impacts is he liberates a group of Hebrew exiles who have been, when the Neo-Babylonians capture Judea, they round up a lot of the aristocracy, they take them to live in Babylon. This is the so-called Babylonian captivity in the Bible. And it seems that it's in this period of time that Yahweh worship as a monotheistic practice develops amongst this group of aristocrats in exile. And Cyrus, who is always trying to find supporters as he builds this big multicultural empire, allows them to return, where they build the Second Temple. And Judaism, as develops, Second Temple Judaism, really is an Achaemenid phenomenon. This is where the final versions of the Hebrew Bible are finalized and written down, and it's probably the first time that, again, Judaism emerges as a true monotheistic religion. So that just sort of gives you a sense of how important the Achaemenid Empire is to sort of this whole region. So the Achaemenid Empire is huge. Again, it sprawls all the way from Anatolia, and then at times the Achaemenids control what's now Pakistan over the Hindu Kush, although their control across the Hindu Kush is sporadic, but again, from Anatolia to Afghanistan is one way of thinking about the Persian Empire, and of course also includes the Levant, and from time to time Egypt, although Egypt is a possession that often rebels and falls in and out of Achaemenid control. So this is an incredibly powerful empire, extremely wealthy, and capable of mobilizing military manpower on a grand scale. Now, from time to time, however, it suffers difficulties. There are some satrapal revolts in the Aegean in the 350s, so-called satraps revolt. And in the 330s, there's actually been several coups. So this is actually the Alexander the Great is striking in the aftermath of some real dynastic unrest. In 338, Artaxerxes III, who had been a really aggressive and successful king, indeed had helped to stabilize the empire, had recaptured Egypt after a period of territorial loss. He puts the empire back together. But Artaxerxes III is assassinated in 338, and then his son, who apparently isn't pliant enough for certain factions in the Achaemenid court, is assassinated in 336. And sort of an ancillary member of the royal family is raised up, who assumes the name Darius III, and he takes power in 336. Roughly the same time as Alexander. So on one hand, it's unclear that this dynastic strife necessarily has weakened the empire, but it is something that's going on shortly before Alexander invades. And of course, you might say, well, the Macedonians have something quite similar in the sense that in 336, one king is killed and a new king comes to power. It is a reminder that dynastic strife is a potential weakness, and also a reminder that Darius III, like Alexander, is a very new and untested king, possibly still trying to find his footing. Now, one downside, you might say, of the Achaemenid Empire is actually one of its strengths. It's huge. So while it is big and you can draw huge amounts of resources from a large territory, it also is a sprawling empire to actually both administer and also defend. And the way that Persian kings have basically made that space manageable is to divide the empire into satrapies. We might call them the equivalent of provinces. So there are various satrapies across the empire administered by a regional governor called a satrap. And those satraps have a lot of independence, and they have to. The empire is so big that it takes weeks to months, even with the advanced Persian infrastructure, for a message to move across the empire. I mean, and there are places where the Persians have a kind of Pony Express system to try to push a message really quickly. But even then, it can take days and weeks. So that means that satraps have a lot of, and they're allowed to take a lot of initiative. Because they may have to make immediate decisions for particularly defense without being able to consult the Persian king on every minute detail. Now, one potential weakness of the empire is Persian kings are aware that could be usurpers and rebels and people who might want to have breakaway kingdoms. Well, the satrapies have military forces. They have the ability to raise money to hire additional mercenaries to supplement their garrisons. And from time to time, Persian kings even allow satraps to go to war with one another. If one satrap, say, wants a particularly wealthy city in its tax base, sometimes they'll actually fight about it. So satraps do have their own military forces, largely for the purpose of garrison and regional defense. But those forces are not large. Satraps do not command particularly large or decisive field armies, because that would be dangerous to the Persian king. Indeed, one satrap who is allowed to raise an enormous field army in at the turn of the 5th and 4th century BC, he's the brother of the king Cyrus the Younger. He's the brother of King Artaxerxes II. He raises a huge army and tries to overthrow his brother, a massive Persian civil war, which involves Greek mercenaries that Cyrus has hired. And so this shows the danger of a satrap having too many military forces. And so what that means is most satraps at most have sort of modest garrisons. If there's a really severe threat, the Persian king has a cadre of Persian troops, supposedly 10,000 infantry called the Immortals, and also royal cavalry, and these troops can accompany the king as he circulates around the empire. And he also has the ability to levy troops from across the empire and concentrate them in extraordinarily large field armies. And so that's what the Persian king will do if he faces a particularly serious threat that the satraps can't deal with. Now, there's one problem with this strategy. It takes a long time for the Persian king to raise that big field army. Not only does he have to assess that the threat is serious enough to warrant his action, so he has to start getting messages saying, oh boy, we're in trouble. But then the act of mobilizing from across the big empire is a slow and ponderous event. So this is actually something that we'll see when we talk about Alexander the Great's campaigns. He's first going to face the satrapal armies in Asia Minor that are really, they're put up some spirited resistance, but they're really no match for his army. And then he's going to confront the ponderously raised but extraordinarily large army personally led by Darius II. Because it's a big empire, one other way that the Persians govern it, in addition to delegating power to all of these satraps, is through infrastructure. And the Persians, really rely on physical infrastructure to link together the huge expanses of continent that comprise their empire. So there is, for example, a royal road that runs to Sardis, and there are many other highways. Again, where it's not just a road, but it's supply depots, it's messenger stations, it's stables where a messenger moving across can exchange horses. And indeed, all the supply depots are particularly important because all throughout the Persian Empire are huge supply caches that are very carefully administered. So an administrator who, say, is moving from one place to another can draw supplies as he goes for himself and his entourage. We have some of these documents. They're preserved in a cache of clay documents that are referred to as the Persian Persepolis fortification tablets. Very routine humdrum stuff, receipts for rations, receipts for pay, things like that. But they show how the Persians, by managing the flow of goods throughout the empire, are able to control a huge amount of space. Because if you can push an administrator, all the way across the empire using not just roads but supply depots, you can govern your empire. If you can move your army across the empire, not just marching on the roads, but with caches of rations, you can. That's your defense policy. There is one downside, and this is actually the problem of thinking about infrastructure in defense terms. Your infrastructure that allows you to move administrators and troops through your empire also flows in the opposite direction. It can be infrastructure that an enemy can use to invade your empire. And this is, I think, actually an important point for understanding the logistics of Alexander the Great. In part because there is some evidence that Alexander the Great, while he's very good at battle tactics, he's extremely good at battle tactics. He's sort of this military genius when it comes to the right moment to strike with his cavalry at the right place. He has an uncanny sixth sense about it. There's some reason to believe that Alexander the Great is not very good at logistics inherently. We'll talk as we talk about his campaigns, but there's a famous moment where he just marches his men across the desert, and they kind of are dying of thirst and hunger, and Alexander, logistics may not be his genius. He's lucky, though, in that he is invading a territory that has infrastructure of control, highways and supply depots, that can also be an infrastructure for invasion. He can move across Persian infrastructure, and importantly, he can draw from these supply depots. And also, as he can increasingly claim to have displaced Darius, and we're going to talk much more this week about the specifics of conquest, but Darius is at some point defeated, and Alexander the Great he claims to be the new Persian king. This also gives him even more infrastructural power, because a lot of Persian administrators say, "Oh, new king, we're used to that. This is the third we've had in 6 years. We're here to now administer the flow of rations and money and peoples to you the way we had previously administered that to Darius and Artaxerxes IV and Artaxerxes III. And of course, it is not impossible that the recent succession of kings also makes people a little more willing to say, "Oh, well, another king down. Well, I guess Alexander the Great's the king. That's fine." So anyway, that's the Persian Empire at the cusp of Alexander's conquest. The Greeks themselves, who kind of like narratives of decline and decadence, are happy, particularly post facto, to create a narrative of decline and decadence. The Persian Empire periodically has its own problems, and again, it is having dynastic problems in the 330s. But in the 4th century, it's about as robust as it's ever been. And indeed, with Artaxerxes' reconquest of Egypt, it's in many ways more robust than it often is. So this is a serious empire with robust infrastructure, with powerful military forces. and it is not destined to fall. The invasion of Alexander the Great is in many ways a black swan event. I mean, anyone who had followed Macedonian history for the last 200 years would not think that the Macedonians would all of a sudden be strong enough, powerful enough to invade the Persian Empire and overthrow the Achaemenid dynasty. So next time we're going to talk about some of the Alexander the Great and his army that is capable of doing that, and then we'll talk about the campaigns of Alexander from 334 to his death in 323. It's going to be an exciting week.